The Department of English at the Missouri State University presents Let's Read The Wanderer. Together, we're going to read The Wanderer now. In the first 2 minutes for 2 minutes and 30 seconds following this brief preface, I am going to read aloud lines 1 through 36 of The Wanderer in the Exeter book Elegies. I think that reading aloud can illuminate texts for students. To hear it spoken to you can sometimes make the unclear sense of something become clear. Reading poetry aloud to yourself, I think, is crucial as well to really engage with poetry, because poetry, whether it's narrative poetry or lyric poetry, short or long, new or old, is meant to be heard. It's meant to be experienced bodily, not just mentally. Poetry is about making things out of sound. For the next 2.5 minutes, I'm going to read the poem aloud to you, and then we're going to focus on a few key passages and practice some interpretation together. Thanks for coming along with me on this ride. Page 66 in the Broadview Anthology of British Literature, The Wanderer. The author is anonymous. It survives, as we discussed, in one manuscript in the Old English language. What we are reading here is a translation. Always the one alone longs for mercy. The Maker's mildness, though, troubled in mind, across the ocean waves he has long been forced to stir with his hands the frost-cold sea, and walk in exile's paths. Weird is fully fixed. Thus spoke the wanderer, mindful of troubles, of cruel slaughters, and dear kinsman's downfall. Oft alone in the first light of dawn I have sung my lament. There is none living to whom I would dare to reveal clearly my heart's thoughts. I know it is true, that it is a nobleman's lordly nature to closely bind his spirit's coffer, hold fast his treasure hoard, whatever he may think. The weary mind cannot withstand weird, the troubled heart can offer no help. And so those eager for fame often bind fast in their breast coffers a sorrowing soul, just as I have had to take my own heart, often wretched, cut off from my own homeland, far from dear kinsmen, and bind it in fetters. Ever since long ago I hid my gold-giving friend in the darkness of earth, and went wretched, winter sad, over the ice-locked waves, sought, hall-sick, a treasure-giver, wherever I might find, far or near, someone in a mead hall who might know my people, or who would want to comfort me, friendless, accustom me to joy. He who has come to know how cruel a companion is sorrow, for one with few dear friends will understand. The path of exile claims him, not patterned gold, a winter-bound spirit, not the wealth of earth. He remembers hall-holders and treasure-taking, how in his youth his gold-giving lord accustomed to the feast. That joy has all faded. I apologize for the poor quality of the resolution. Nevertheless, we will do our best. We notice that the poem begins with a kind of general statement. Always the one alone longs for mercy. The speaker here is making a statement about life. One of the first things I like to do when I read a poem is to say, who's talking? Who are they talking to? What are they trying to communicate? This is a different approach to poetry than thinking of it as a riddle of symbols that you need to sort of solve or unpack. I think of every poem as an utterance, as an act of communication. And if it uses symbols and cryptic language, as this one does, it's to say things in a more intensive way, not just in a more mysterious way. Always the one alone longs for mercy. The one alone is the theme of this poem. The one alone is the wanderer. He longs for mercy, the Maker's mildness. These two phrases are apposite one another. They are the Maker's mildness is a positive phrase that modifies the first thing. Old English poetry uses apposition like this constantly. It always says things in 2 or 3 different ways rather than just in one way, and puts them next to each other. It has this quality of accumulation to it. Always the one alone longs for mercy, troubled in mind. We see here again that there's a positive phrase modifying the one alone. So really, the one alone, troubled in mind, has long been forced. Across the ocean ways he has long been forced, to stir with his hands the frost-cold sea and walk in exile's path. Now, in early medieval society, in primitive society, material culture is such that if you're exiled from your people, you're not going to go and find a motel to stay in. You're not going to be able to just sort of, get by, find a new town, find a job, pump gas, or whatever. We're talking about a world that is mostly wilderness, where survival depends on the cooperation of the band. And so to be exiled from a band, to be without a people, is a lonely and cruel and difficult fate. And fate is what weird means. Now, this word is the source of our modern English word weird, but it has a much bigger and stranger meaning in Old English. It means something like the Greek moira, fate, destiny. And it's a preoccupying theme in Old English literature. Now, curiously, the poem changes speakers now. Thus spoke the wanderer, mindful of troubles, of cruel slaughters, and dear kinsman's downfall. And we get our editor here, because this is a version of a poem that survives in one manuscript in a rather different language. So it's a translation and an edition, and punctuation, an invention of the 16th century, more or less, is added to help guide us. So the poem's already being interpreted for us before you even encounter it. Often alone, there it is again, alone, in the first light of dawn, I have sung my lament. What is a lament? It's a sad song. There is none living to whom I would dare to reveal clearly my heart's thoughts. I know it is true that it is a nobleman's lordly nature to closely bind his spirit's coffer, hold fast his treasure hoard, whatever he may think. Now it's interesting because the speaker in the poem, the person who's being quoted by this first order speaker, the wanderer himself, who's sort of been introduced to us by a kind of narrator figure, is now also speaking in these kind of generalities. There's, I know it is true that it is a nobleman's lordly nature to closely bind his spirit's coffer. What do you think it means to closely bind your spirit's coffer? A coffer is like a lockbox, right? It's like a cash register. So what does it mean to closely bind it? Well, here he's been talking already about revealing his heart's thoughts. And he's talking about his treasure hoard, which is an interesting image, I think, for his heart's thoughts. And so he's closing it up. He's keeping it within him, right? And of course, he's saying that a noble man should not share his feelings. He should not talk about what's inside his mind. And, in the 21st century, we're more enlightened than that. We might say that, that just sounds like toxic masculinity, dude. You really should, open up to us. Let us talk. Well, he is, actually. He is. He's saying that, I know that this is the way a noble man with a lordly nature is supposed to be, but I cannot withstand weird. The troubled heart can offer no help. And so he's going to unload his suffering, his sadness, and most of all, his sense of loss to us, the things that he no longer has. He talks here. Let's go here. He who has come to know. I apologize for the poor resolution here. Like I said, I'm going to find another solution. He who has come to know, line 29, how cruel a companion is sorrow. For one with few dear friends will understand. The path of exile claims him. Not patterned gold. Remember I talked about how the early English settlers were good at metalwork?
not patterned gold, a winter-bound spirit, not the wealth of earth. So note how he sets up these contrasts between the path of exile versus patterned gold, a winter-bound spirit versus the wealth of earth. And notice also how the translator has captured the alliterative pattern to drive home these contrasts, the path of exile versus patterned gold, the winter-bound spirit versus the wealth of earth, to bring these things together in order to contrast them. He remembers hall holders and treasure-taking, how in his youth his gold-giving lord accustomed him to the feast. That joy has all faded. Now, the Wanderer here is speaking to the social organization of the warrior elites in the Old English world, where kings were more like chieftains or warband leaders, rather than the hereditary sort of majestic king of the later Middle Ages. And the king won the loyalty of his warriors by giving them treasure. So we get the term ring giver or ring friend or gold friend, all of these kennings or these combinations of words like heart's coffer, these sort of riddling expressions for other ideas. You'll find this in the glossary in the idea of kenning. That is a kind of metaphor that's made out of two compounded words. And he no longer, having been exiled, no longer offers his service as a warrior to a king, and no longer receives treasure and protection from his king in return. He's like the masterless samurai in the Ronin in old samurai movies. This is the kind of idea that's going on here. And so he's been forced to forego his lord's beloved words of counsel. And he goes on over this a little bit longer. Let's go to a famous passage on page 67 onto the top of 66, and I'll come back to the text here. He who deeply considers with wise thoughts this foundation and this dark land, old in spirit, often remembers so many ancient slaughters and says these words: Where has the horse gone? Where is the rider? Where is the giver of gold? Where are the seats of the feast? Where are the joys of the hall? Oh, the bright cup! Oh, the brave warrior! Oh, the glory of princes! How the time passed away, slipped into nightfall as if it had never been. Now, you might remember this if you're a big nerd as being very similar to the speech that the king of the Riders of Rohan, I think it's Eomer, gives as they're preparing for their last stand against the army of Saruman as it's marching towards Helm's Deep. Where's the horse and rider? And so on and so forth. And this is because Tolkien, once again, was an Old English scholar, and his work was deeply informed by these ancient texts. And The Lord of the Rings is pervaded with this sense of loss, of fading, of the beauty of the world, but also the transitory nature of that beauty and the sorrow of loss that accompanies all joy. There is this mixed up kind of aesthetic experience. The author of this, amazing that the string trimmer just started again outside my window as I was recording this. Sorry. What was I saying? Tolkien was a Catholic and thus a Christian and a very devout one. And one of the things that he takes from Old English poetry and from this kind of heroic poetry, which takes this pagan Germanic inheritance that glorifies the brave warrior and the works of men, but frames it in the context of eternity, in the same way that this poem is framed by the inner speaker who is sad at his loss is framed by an outer speaker who's quoting him. So said the wise one in his mind, sitting apart in meditation. He is good who keeps his word. And the man
who never too quickly shows the anger in his breast, unless he already knows the remedy a noble man can bravely bring about. It will be it will be well for one who seeks mercy, consolation from the Father in heaven, where for us all stability stands. In other words, as the old gospel number says, I got a home on high, right? I may have been exiled from my earthly Lord, but my heavenly Lord will bring me home, and he keeps his word. And so there's this sense that there's these two competing worldviews. There's these two truths that the the Old English warrior has to negotiate, and that the one is higher ultimately and larger than the other. And so we see in this poem an example of that syncretism, that combination of two worldviews, of two ways of being in the world, and seeing how each illuminates the other and shows truths about the other. I think that will do for now for our opening salvo into reading together. I hope you enjoyed this poem. I think it's beautiful. I think it's moving. I think we can all relate, even though we're not, Germanic warriors whose mead halls have been burnt down by enemy bands of raiders. I think we can all relate to the idea of loss and the transitory nature of earthly joy and searching for something that is higher and more enduring than that in some way or other. The next poem that we're going to read together is The Wife's Lament, and we're going to talk about, I'm going to post discussion board questions about several passages in that, and I hope you can use some of the ideas and concepts that I introduced in this video in our discussion of that. And then we're going to read, and then I'm going to do another video, one of these videos to be posted by Thursday at the latest, hopefully, on L'Envol by Marie de France, which is a work that is very different in tone and spirit. And yeah, that's it for today. I've been told by the experts that students don't like videos that are too long. I hope this wasn't too long for you. Thank you for reading with me, and see you next time.